Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Risa, for your presentation. I will start first to share my presentation.
Yes, please.
And it's a message here, host disabled participants screen sharing. So I'll try once again. Okay, should work now. Okay, can you see my presentation and hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to see you once again, even it is still in online format. But hope we'll can have a possibility to meet each other in face-to-face interaction. And I would like also to thank you, Risa, Andreia, and Irina, for organizing this seminar. My presentation will be about sensitive object of representation. Representations, comparing to our presentations, it's more theoretical, but I will hope it will be not boring for you. I would like to speak some theoretical and methodological aspects related to the study of this kind of social objects that are called sensitive objects of representations. And more specifically, I will try to outline some aspects regarding to how to access to the unspoken part of the representation, and how the use of qualitative methodologies and that can allow us to make particular conditions of interaction and a more reflective position from the researcher can allow this access to the unspoken part of the representation. When we speak about the social object, in the social representation studies, we know that starting to study a social representation, we must, first of all, to emphasize if we can speak about a social object as an object of social representation. And from this point of view, there are some conditions that we should take into account when we speak about the social object as a social object of representation. But speaking about sensitive objects of representation, if they have or they can be approached as an object of representation, they have an ambiguous content due to the presence of certain hidden areas. So sensitive objects results from the conflictual intergroup dynamic and are not openly discussed within intergroup frame, are not usually openly discussed because people speaking about such kind of objects try to self-censor their discourse, and this phenomenon can remain relatively absent in the attempt to research your representations. So the problem faced by researchers in this case can be, can you speak about social representation or not in this case? Speaking about and approaching in a more approaching this kind of social objects, because it is my one of my research interest in the last years. So speaking about sensitive objects of representations, we should take into account at least three questions. How social phenomena as an object of representations can become sensitive. The second, what are the specific conditions, social, ideological, historical, that make them like this in the collective imaginary? And how they manifest both in an intergroup context and within research, more particularly within research situations. A social phenomena can become an object of representations. This is an object of social knowledge derived from direct or indirect experience of a group, and this object have profound social implications. The appearance of an object of representations generates public debates that can be contradictory and that can lead to potential conflicts and social imbalances. This is a short introduction. I will not going to speak about all conditions, but more specifically, I would like to outline the content of a social object of representations. As researchers outline, the object of representations contain certain zones of tension. It is specifically zones of conflictual content, and the identification of these tensions allow researcher for a better understanding of the context in which the meanings, practices, and experience related to the objects were or are still elaborated. Meanings can be consensual or polarized. Meanings are expressed in relation to the others, and meanings are the expression of historical, social, cultural context. And an object of representation can become a sensitive object. It depends on the way it is approached in the academic environment. It depends on the way it is communicated in the society or within the specific social groups. And of course, it depends on the dynamic of intergroup relations. Sensitive objects, trying to make some definition or some points that characterize the sensitive objects, are objects with a strong identity and symbolic stake. They are based on intergroup antagonism and are perceived as significant for one group and threatening for other groups. And they have areas of tensions, contradictions, many controversial and counter-normative aspects in their representational content. How specifically object of representation can become sensitive? I outlined some conditions, some social, ideological, and historical conditions regarding to this aspect. And first of all is how the social opinions or beliefs related to the social objects are legitimized or not by some institutions with social authority, religious, political, academic, or scientific institutions. And how these objects are approached, taking into consideration normative and counter-normative social behavior, social aspects that guide social behavior, and even if they are approved or non-approved, and of course the nature of intergroup relations. So if this opinion and beliefs and social practices, of course, related to the social objects are legitimized by social institutions, they become socially acceptable. So in this case, people do not have restrictions in expressing them openly. If not, they can become silent, especially when there are some risks or some social sanctions. And if it's this situation, people usually mask their opinion in public sphere or do not openly discussed, at least in the public spheres. once certain beliefs acquire a level of legitimacy, these masking strategies that subjects usually use are no longer necessary. So here are some examples, some empirical examples derived from some studies that illustrate what I am telling now. It's a study of Vala about how anti-racist normative pressure after the Second World War determined the transformation in the social representation of racism. The study of Liu and his colleagues about how some alternative visions of history are blocked by the state control, and this would not allow the possibility to circulate this alternative vision, and the emergence of polemical social representation also can be illustrative in this case. So sensitive objects also can be determined by some historical events, for example, shameful historical events, or some past controversies that have not been resolved till the present. And they are not directly related to the present experience of the group, but knowledge and social practices, but they are related to the in-group past. And studies show that specifically about collective guilt, that negative, this attitude about negative actions from the in-group past is experienced more intensively by later generations than by those who were directly involved in these actions. So taking into considerations these aspects, sometimes it is difficult to capture the content, the real content of the social representation. Over time, the discourses related to the sensitive objects can turn in some taboo issues because people perceive their incapacity to interact with other in public debates regarding these sensitive issues. And this also can be followed by a prolonged period of inability to develop social consensus. So sensitive objects can go into a register of silent topics which are not discussed, at least not in public sphere. So being self-censored in various social interactions, and also in research interactions, they could remain absent in an attempt to analyze them, because they are characterized by some contradictory discourses and difficulties in identifying the concrete structure of social representations, speaking about structural theory in this sense, and it is difficult to identify which elements, cognitive elements, can be treated as peripheral or central. And as I also mentioned this earlier, it is difficult to answer to this question: is a representation in this case or not? So I outlined two types of sensitive objects. First is the objects of representations that becomes sensitive even from the incipient phase in the representation formation due to its extremely sensitive character. And so it remains a poorly defined object at the representational level. And the second, the object of representation becomes sensitive over time after repeatedly being confronted with a contested representation from the other. Therefore, it is difficult for the first to be represented in the collective mind, and for the second to be represented in an intergroup context. Although contradictory meanings can coexist in the content of a social representation, we would like to add that these meanings coexist without excluding each other, as long as they are not expressed in an intergroup frame marked by polemical discourses. The discourse is limited usually to in-group settings where it can be openly expressed without causing tensions with the other. Outside this context, discourse and implicitly the potential conflict lie dormant, unvoiced, and non-externalized. In the case of social sensitive objects, to recognize a discourse of one group implicitly, its social representation, means to deny that of the another group. They are not complementary, but conflictually opposed to each other. And the opposition of the discourses related to sensitive objects and the difficulties in addressing them electrifies social interactions, and the communications is often restricted only to that of in-group frame. Sensitive objects are objects that fall into the gap with a less satisfactory reality. Take the form, usually, of polemical social representations for various social actors, and generates conflict situations derived from this contradictory and controversial content, and place social groups, but sometimes also academic ones, in apparently irreconcilable opposition. And in conclusion, some conclusions. Research of sensitive objects of representations raises several questions that researchers beginning to study such topic should try to answer. First of all, why certain elements from the content of social representations are not expressed by the people, and why they do not appear in the data collected from them. The second, what are the factors that influence the subject's discursive production, and how could we access to this unspoken part of social representation? And what are those psychosocial conditions of interactions, of research interactions that will favor the emergence of more open discourse of the subjects? And in relation to the sensitive objects, the subjects usually produce a normative discourse under usually conditions of interactions. But when we organize special conditions, their discourse can be more open from this point of view. That means that we should permanent to redesign our research methodology, research design, and to readjust our methods in order to allow this to the unspoken part of the representation. And I think the use of the qualitative methodologies in this way can create such particular conditions that and a more reflective position about one's own role in the production of the subject discourse can allow the researcher to access to this hidden area or conflicting zone of from the content of social representations. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.